Hello everyone, welcome. I'm Kendra Larson. Nice to see everybody. I'm the Art Gallery Director and Clark Arts Talks Coordinator. If you haven't yet, go check out the show downstairs. It's closing next week, so this is your chance. Also, the next exhibit will be the Art Student Annual, so please submit your work. It's really easy to do, it's a really cool show, it's really fun, so please do that. Thank you, Faith, and everybody for helping with the chairs. Y'all are amazing. There are snacks back there, please help yourself. Today, we are very lucky to have Miel Paredes here. Miel is a metalsmith, jewelry maker, and stop-motion puppet skeleton builder. She is known for her work on Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio in 2022, Paranorman in 2012, and Box Trolls in 2014. She was born in Luigi, where her neighbors owned a pig named Houdini. Named Houdini because of his frequent attempts to escape into the mangrove swamp. Memories of that large, smelling animal and the delicious dinner he became have stayed with Miel through her life. While she studied metalsmithing at California College of Art and Craft in Oakland and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her metal work incorporates the animal figures and traditional ornamental devices to interpret the ways in which we humans manipulate our environment to suit our needs, deconstructing and reconstructing both inanimate and animate objects. She lives with her husband and 2 children, 2 cats, 6 fish, is growing a wildflower garden outside her home studio window in Portland, Oregon. So let's all welcome Miel.
Thanks, Kendra. Thank you all for being here. The first time I came here was actually to see a show by one of my former professors, Kim Kreidler, in the Art Gallery. And it was an amazing show, amazing space. And I actually also know Allie. I'm just gonna hold this. We worked together at I was working at the Oregon College of Art and Craft as the metal studio manager, and I taught some of the classes, and Allie was one of my star pupils, so you're very lucky to have her as an instructor. And thank you for that introduction. I was really fortunate. I took my first metals class when I was actually in high school. I went to a public high school in Madison, Wisconsin. We were really, really lucky that we had so many options. A lot of my friends wanted to take photography, and we took a lot of Gothic pictures of each other in the cemetery across the street from my high school. But I wanted to take metals, and from the first moment that I lit that torch, it was just all over from there. So I like to start out this presentation by talking about my influences and inspiration. I really believe that none of us, make work in a vacuum. We're all inspired and influenced by, who we are, where we were born, who our parents were, who our friends are, pop culture, history, all of those things. We take them all in and kind of synthesize them, and they show up in our work in one way or another. In some ways I feel like my work, everything I've ever made is in some way a self-portrait. So again, I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. There was a rumor about a funeral home down the street from my high school that had taxidermied animals and dioramas in the basement. And it was the kind of thing where you'd sort of dare each other to go, check out this funeral home. And for some reason I never went in high school, but then when I went back to Madison for graduate school, I finally went. And it was this amazing place where the owner of this funeral home had acquired somehow all of these. There were squirrels, there were birds, mostly squirrels, but mostly small animals, some raccoons, and he had set them up in all these dioramas in his basement. And supposedly, when people were there for a funeral or a memorial service, to cheer them up, he would take them into the basement and show them these dioramas. And he had albino squirrels playing basketball, I remember that. They were driving in a Barbie car. I could talk on and on about this basement. It was pretty amazing. And that's something that I've always been really interested in, just sort of, this need to create, right? Like he ran a funeral home, so had this need to create these dioramas out of these animals and share them with the world. And you get a lot of that in Wisconsin. I have a feeling that the winters kind of do a little bit of something to you, but it's littered with these sort of outsider art installations. And that was something I really loved about it in the summers. We would take little road trips and we'd drive around and see like the largest fiberglass muskie in the world, and this concrete park by this guy who ran a bar, and then he would take all the smashed glass from this bar and make them into sculptures in his backyard, so things like that. And then on the right, there's sort of this technical masterpiece of metalsmithing. So my background is in metalsmithing. I also took, ceramics and glass blowing and sculpture, but metalsmithing is kind of really, that's really the medium that I fell in love with. And I love these pieces made for Tiffany. There's one that's very similar, that's a bunch of snails piled up into this vase shape. So I love the technical mastery of it, but I also love the kind of surrealism and absurdity of it. And you kind of wonder if there's meaning behind, using the owl as this decorative element, or if it's merely that it's just really cool and interesting, sort of mesmerizing imagery. And that's something I think about a lot in my own work, the use of animals as ornaments, and sort of combining it with this sort of absurdist, but also technically amazing work. And then when I was in undergrad, I found this book of Japanese samurai helmets, and I fell so in love with this book because it really struck me the way that, these samurai helmets would use this kind of imagery, like on the one side you see the eggplant, which you wouldn't necessarily think of as being an image, that would imbue you with power as you go into battle. But it's actually representative of an area of Japan where, that was one of their prize crops. So it represents their land, it represents nourishment. So then you think of it as that, in that way, it ends up being a very powerful emblem that you want to take with you into battle, as symbolic of what you're fighting for. And then for the morning glory helmet, it's a flower that opens in the morning and then closes at night, so it becomes this really powerful symbol of the cycle of life and death, which also would be an amazing talisman to bring with you into battle. And then you have these German hunting knives, and this is kind of a more, sort of Western-coded idea of like the, decoration giving more power to, like a weapon, right? So it's the stronger animals doing the weaker animal. And again, this sort of technical mastery and this use of ornament to imbue an object with more power. And then we have this installation by Tara Donovan, which when I was in school, it was kind of, something like this, I think, would have been kind of shown to me an example of not decorative, right? Like it's an installation piece, it's very stark, it's sort of this landscape. But the more I look at it and the more I think about, that the use of repetition, the use of line, the way that everything is considered, to me it ends up becoming decorative. And it does end up becoming about craft. Because I'm not really even sure if people talk about art versus craft anymore, but it was a big thing when I was in school, because I went to the California College of Arts and Crafts. And they eventually got rid of the word crafts because, well, there are many reasons. But I remember it was one of the discussions that we had a lot of the time. And for me, I think that craft and art, it's just something that you consider. It's the consideration that goes into something, it's the technique that goes into something, it's the work that goes into something. So for me, and it's paper. Like what other craftier material is there than paper? It's readily available. So the boombox piece, I have a love-hate relationship with Instagram. I spend way too much time on it. Scrolling, doom scrolling. I love it for the artists that I find on it, and Vanessa German is an example of an artist that I found out about through Instagram. And I love her work. It's really hard to tell the scale of this piece. It's actually, I've seen a picture of her standing next to it, and the top of the handle actually comes up to her shoulder. Yeah, so she makes these monumental, really amazing pieces that are, collaged together out of found objects. And then she has these really amazing titles for them, and a lot of the time the titles for her pieces are kind of incorporate all the things that are in them, so they become kind of a recipe. And her work is just really beautiful. And then the Adventures of Prince Ahmed, this is the oldest surviving full-length animated film. There are 2 other animated films that were made earlier, but they are considered lost. I think I'm forgetting who, but they're made in Argentina. And as you know, I ended up working in stop-motion animation, and I love animation. With these pieces, they also make me think a lot about the shadow puppets from Southeast Asia, and whether or not, there's a direct relation between the two, I don't know, but just sort of, the idea that the universality of storytelling through that medium, through light and shadow and paper, and I think some of these puppets are actually made out of sheets of lead, I find really fascinating, because these were made in Germany. This movie was made in Germany. And then the embroidery on the left side, sorry, I'm facing the wrong other way from you guys. I do a lot of embroidery of my own. I really love kind of this, not really Renaissance, but I love seeing more textile work in the art world, and I'm interested in quilting. I made this dress. I'm interested in, all of these different crafts. So I really, I also take a little bit of an issue when, the work has to be sort of at a certain level or a certain caliber to be considered gallery worthy. Because when you look at these, like there's a textile and quilting museum in Tillamook. Has anyone ever been there? It's a Latimer quilting museum, and it's amazing. It's amazing, and you think about, the math and the color consideration. Again, there's that word, consideration, that went into making these quilts, the work that went into them. The G's Ben quilters who made these amazing works of art, just with the scraps that they had available to them, that, was an issue of survival, was an issue of staying warm, was an issue of keeping their homes, keeping themselves from freezing in the winter. So I think about that a lot. I love, the sort of textile movement in art, but I try to be very conscious of where it kind of came from and what is considered, high art and what is considered, your grandma's book that someone's going to find in Goodwill like 20 years from now and turn into a coat and wear it on Instagram. And I'm probably going to like the video. And then Alexander Calder, his circus, there's a video of him, if you haven't already seen this, there's a video of him playing circus with his characters. And it's the most, it's just adorable. And I was introduced to Alexander Calder's work in Washington, D.C. My family lived there for a while. And my mom would take us to the museums because it was free, and we didn't, have the money to do anything else, but we had all of these free museums that we would go to. And so I was introduced to his giant mobiles, and I loved them. But then when I saw this work and I saw, the mechanisms that he was able to make just out of wire, and, he dressed them up to make these characters and, perform them for like really famous artists in Paris in the 1920s. This is my favorite work of his. Again, there's animation. I love Studio Ghibli films. My BFA show was highly influenced by My Neighbor Totoro, because I had never seen it before. I saw it in art school, and I love the fact that, there wasn't this idea of good and evil. There wasn't this kind of great conflict in that movie. There was a story, and it was basically just, the story of this one segment of these children's lives, and, how they interacted with their environment and the way that they saw their environment, and the imagination that got them through, difficulties. And then the carousel animal, I don't know if anyone's heard of the House on the Rock, going back to We're going back to Wisconsin and all the amazing things there. This carousel animal is not part of the House on the Rock, but the House on the Rock is another like sort of outsider artist collection. There was a man who, legend had it, was rejected from Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture school, so he decided to go out into Spring Green, Wisconsin and build his own house out of rock, wheelbarrowing in all the rocks himself. And one of the things in the House on the Rock, and it's a day-long trip to go and look at all the things that this man has collected, is a carousel, and it has like 300 and something animals, and none of them is a horse. And so that kind of, goes back into craft and function and animals as ornament is, which animals are worthy of riding in a carousel, and what choice you have, when you're picking which animal to ride as a kid. I remember that was really, really important. If someone else got on the carousel animal I wanted, it was devastating. And then the furnishing flounce, they're influencing this from Italy, from France, there's language in it from all these different places in Europe. But then for me, with my background from the Philippines, there are very similar, motifs where there's sort of this wave motif or leaf motif. If you look closely, there are figures that look like they could be mermaid related. There are ghosts, there's sort of these foliated animals. Just sort of that idea of ornament. And again, sort of that thing that I learned in school, or that was discussed in school, not that I learned in school. The value of ornament. Is it just ornament, or does it tell a story? Or is it a narrative, or is it just to make things look pretty or feel important? The amount of work that you put into this item, which then adorns a space, and the ways that elevates it somehow. But how you can put so much into that, so much, of your story and your history into that. And then these examples of horse armor, and all of what that implies, the idea of the, domestication of animals and then sending them into war for us, or even just, in a lot of the cases, the animals that went into war didn't have armor, so these were purely ceremonial. So then the idea of that ceremonial armor, and the craftspeople who worked on that work and how much time and effort went into it, not even necessarily to imbue the piece with power in the moment of battle, but just to elevate them as they walked through a parade, but then went home and sent the poor kids out to fight their wars for them. I'm an avid reader. I love reading Black Sun, Rebecca Roanhorse. It's actually a trilogy. It's a really wonderful book. If you like, it's classified as fantasy, but I feel like it kind of defies genres, at least for me. Just the world building in it is kind of set in a world that's like pre-colonial America. And in the book, there's a lot of talk about amulets, about clothing, about weapons that are imbued with a certain type of power, and the crafts that go into making those things. Highly recommend. And then this gold ornament, my family's from the Philippines, and in school I had all these examples of Western art and Japanese art, and it kind of took me a little while to start thinking about where my people came from and try to look for examples of Filipino art, specifically pre-colonial Filipino art, and it's really hard to find because the Philippines are an archipelago of over 7,000 islands. The different groups in the Philippines they're very different. There are tons of different dialects that were colonized by Spain. And the art, when they were colonized, a lot of it didn't survive because it was made out of wood or it was made out of palm fronds and grasses and things like that. But there was a really long history of gold work in the Philippines. And when the Spaniards arrived in the Philippines, they were really taken aback by these savages that had all this gold, and so they promptly took the gold and melted it down and made it into their own ornaments. So it's really difficult to find surviving examples of gold. Okay, so This first helmet is actually a piece that I made in undergrad. So this relates back to the samurai helmets. You know, and the idea of what animals are used in armor as, you know, protective or ferocious or, you know, something that you wouldn't want to wear with you in battle. And it also, for me, you know, there's absurdity to it, right? It's this miniaturized cow skin that's slung over your head that's supposed to be protection. Lengua is the name of my favorite dish that my mom used to make for me. Lengua means tongue. It also means language. My family's from the Philippines. I don't speak Tagalog except for the swear words. And the reason why I know the swear words is because there's a certain level of swear word that my mom would say, and I would know, depending on which swear word she busted out, how angry she was, and what, you know, how much trouble I was in. You know, so the idea of a cow, I was, you know, also ended up living in Wisconsin. You know, the idea of the herd, of anonymity, of trying to fit in, of being ridiculed for the food that you eat, of not speaking the language. I mean, I did speak it when I was little, but I lost it. You know, not speaking the language of your mother. So I felt like that was, you know, all of those things would factor in to a protective object. And then this was a helmet that I made a lot with. If I had all the time in the world, I'd probably just make fancy helmets. Like if I could, you know, get someone to commission me to make them like a full body armor of some fancy creature out of metal, I would be in heaven. I would love to do it. I need to get on it though, because honestly, my hammering elbow, as I'm getting older, I'm 48 now, it's not what it was when I met this guy. So if you know anyone, send them my way. But for this piece, I was at, you know, University of Wisconsin-Madison. I was looking at the ducks on the pond, and I was thinking about decoys, these beautiful pieces of art that are made essentially to lure ducks to their death. But my in-laws have a collection of decoys that are, you know, really, really beautiful, and they have been used. But then they also sit on the shelf as kind of, you know, this trophy of their past life. Another thing I would love to make if I had all the time, I would love to just tinker. I would love to work with mechanisms, moving parts. You know, I made a whole series of toys, and actually, when I was working at OCAC, I taught a toy making workshop. And someone taking that toy making workshop was like, oh, there's this place like it, and they're making the stop motion animated movie. And would you like to work there? And I said, yes, I very much would. And I applied a bunch of times and didn't hear back. And then, like, I don't even know how many months or maybe a year later, you know, got an interview and showed them my work, and it was an amazing fit. But again, these toys, you know, sort of the idea of like what animals are worthy of playing with, what do we experiment on, what do we cut apart and put back together and see if we can make them work any better or make our lives work any better. So there's a darkness to these toys, so this bunny that's cut in half but made to run around regardless. There are videos of all these toys on YouTube, but it's very poor quality video that I took. I don't even know what decade it was a long time ago. But for this one, you push it and then the wings flap and the head moves up and down. He runs, he's very graceful. I was fond of this one. But again, that idea of, you know, sort of the mechanisms that we use to imitate life, you know, and how successful they are. This one has the most views on YouTube and the most comments, my favorite being, OMG, that's creepy, that sheep.
What does that do?
You know, his legs move and his head kind of dangles a little bit. So when I was 14, we moved into a new house in Madison, Wisconsin. And when we looked at the house, we walked into the living room, and I remember there was a taxidermy deer trophy on the wall. So again, more taxidermy in Wisconsin. and the head was turned so that it looked like it had just turned its head to look at you as you were walking into the room. And that's always stayed with me. Sort of that idea that, you're going to kill this animal, and then you're going to stuff it, and then you're going to make it look as lifelike as possible. And I'm not saying, it's right or wrong. I participate in all kinds of, unhealthy things for the world. So, I find it fascinating. I've never, taxidermied an animal. I did really well at the fetal pig dissection in high school, though. And so, that idea that, what animals are worthy of trophies? What animals are worthy of being hunted and then stuffed and then displayed on a wall? So this is Houdini. This is my homage to Houdini that Kendra mentioned in the beginning, the pig. When I was a little kid, and my mom, she tells me the story, I don't really remember it, but she's really horrified not horrified, I guess surprised by the idea that, her darling little girl, I think I was maybe 3 or 4 at the time, that, she thought I would be really upset by the idea that this pig had been killed and had, roasted him in an underground oven and eaten him. So she was trying to break it to me really gently. And then afterwards I was like, well, is there any more? Are they going to get another? I was just hungry. I wanted more pig. And I was surprised that, he was so delicious after he'd been wallowing in the mud. And it was a whole thing. Whenever he would escape, all these big burly, Samoans and Fijian dudes would, gather up rope and then head off into the mangrove swamp to round them up. And it was a huge event. It was a whole neighborhood event. So I feel like that was really a trophy. And then the rabbit's leg, sort of the difference between a wild rabbit and a domesticated rabbit. Everyone knows about the rabbits that run loose in Canyon Beach, right? They were once pets, and someone let their pets loose, and now they're all over the place. And they can't really survive because they're not wild, but because they breed like rabbits. They're all over the place. So is it the speed of the rabbit that makes them pet worthy and makes it so that they can't survive in the wild? So that's why I ended up with this rabbit's leg. Also the image of the lucky rabbit's foot. I've never really understood why that's considered lucky. And then horses, for this one I heard about this kind of horse that they breed. It's bred that when it puts its foot down, it feels pain, so it has this really pronounced walk, and it's bred that way on purpose so that it will have that walk. Also the idea that when horses break their legs and they can't run anymore, they're put down. And I found out recently on Instagram that it's not done lightly. It's the fact that with the way that horses are built, they can't keep their weight off of all 4 legs. If a horse lies down for too long, it'll suffocate under the weight of its own body. And you can't, suspend a horse for however many weeks, months it will take for for that one leg to heal and the rest of them to catch up. So again, thinking about the value of animals, what parts of them are valuable, how we use them, and how we consider them ornamental. The goat was inspired by a petting zoo in Madison, where there are these gigantic goats. They look like goat balloons, and they would kind of push the smaller goats out of the way in the petting zoo to get all the pellets from the kids. And I was like, is this Darwinism in play? Is this survival of the fittest? I don't know. And then I have cats. I have 2 cats. I've always had cats. I find it really fascinating that they let us domesticate them, so that they've domesticated us. They've kind of tricked us into caring for them. I have one cat in particular who hides in the floor when anyone comes over. So this is the cat that's hiding in the walls. Okay, and then this is a series of accessories that I made for animals that were bred for specific purposes. And the accessories would kind of either help or negate the purpose for which they were bred. So these are, I wanted to, I was kind of anthropomorphizing, I still can't say that word, a dachshund. And thinking about humans, as we walk around thinking about, seeing other people and kind of coveting their attributes, right? So a dachshund, trundling down the street and seeing a horse and just really admiring that pair of legs. I would never actually put a dachshund in this piece, don't worry. Purely ornamental. This is a turkey walker for turkeys who have been bred to produce more breast meat. So I wanted to make these kind of like safe turkeys using tracing and repoussé on the front. You can't really see, one of them is clutching an ear of corn and the other one is clutching a fly. And those are cat's feet. So the idea that, there are these turkeys who are bred to produce more breast meat, and then so much that they can't walk. So this is giving them, the means to kind of walk around. It's giving them a little bit of pomp and circumstance, but they're still going to get eaten. But they're going to, hopefully feel good about themselves for a little while. In art school, we lived in a group house, or a bunch of us living in a house together. There was always a random person crashing out in our living room. And one time, the random person left and left a terrarium, which we all thought was empty. And then I found out it had this beautiful little black and white California king snake living in it. So I took myself on a bus from Oakland to Berkeley to buy live mice for this snake that this person abandoned in our house. And it was horrible, and I had nightmares about it. And then, so this is kind of my penance to all of those mice that I sacrificed to this snake. The idea that I could give it armor that looks like an eagle, which is the enemy of the snake, to do battle. Someone like this poor person. And then these are my ear braces and ear positioners for lop-eared rabbits. The first one's pretty straightforward. It's just to keep the ears straight up, because lop-eared rabbits actually end up getting a lot of ear infections. They're bred to have these big long ears, but then they end up with ear infections. And then the ear positioners are so that the rabbit can, make their ears fancy and position them in the way that they want. And this is the wool dispenser. This is for sheep who have, so they don't have to be shorn. When I was living in Australia as a kid, and we went to a sheep farm, and we watched the shearing of the sheep, and a shorn sheep is like the most woebegone creature I've ever seen in my life. So again, the sheep still gets shorn, theoretically, but it has this armor to wear. And there actually are jackets that people will put on their sheep so that the wool doesn't get full of detritus from wandering in the fields, and it stays pretty clean. And that wool is very valuable, and it ends up being marketed to like hand knitters and at fancy textile shows. I'm gonna try to speed it up because I haven't even gotten to the stop motion stuff yet. So these are not in standards. These are a series of wall pieces that I did. Again, thinking about animals and how they're used as ornament, thinking about how rodents are most likely to be the animals living in your home, whether you're aware of it or not. Like, I have rats that live under my house. Most people do. If you see one, you've got way more than you're aware of. Hopefully they're not in the walls, but it happens. So this was a whole series of pieces that I did, over a certain number of years. I really loved working on these pieces. I had a really tiny, tiny home studio, and this was a way that I could continue to do work, because most of these people, they're not more than a foot in diameter. So I could make a bunch of small pieces and then put them together into a larger installation. So that kind of satisfied my craving to make larger work. Thinking about animals that are domesticated, thinking about, I have a horror of nutria. Does anyone else have this? Like their snouts and their big orange teeth scare me to death. Squirrels, so cute. What honestly is the difference? Capybara, love them. Nutria, no. It's like a visceral thing with me. There's certain rodents that are acceptable. Why? Certain rodents, no thank you. And then the standards are based on, the practice of breeding dogs, the idea that all dogs came from wolves, You know, and you see it, right? Like you see it in a chihuahua, and they're really, really fierce, and they see another dog, and they're like, oh, rip you to shreds. You know, and they're remembering that idea that once upon a time they were a wolf, but now they're really cute and they can fit in a Louis Vuitton. They're still really fierce. And again, smaller pieces that I can put together in a larger installation. You know, thinking about that idea of the, you know, the ribbons, the blue standard. Who decided that, you know? Who bred this dog to this certain extent and was like, okay, that one, like that's the standard for that kind of dog. Who made that decision? I was really fortunate to get an artist residency at Glean. And if you don't know what that is, it's a residency where you go to the Portland Metro, the dump, and you dig through all the trash and then you make art out of it. And I already knew that I wanted to do something with plastic because I get really twisted up in knots about the plastic problem, the fact that, you know, it's been put on us as the consumer to recycle our plastic, but then, you know, and I don't know about the rest of you, but I've had that moment where I'm standing, you know, in one of this, like a restaurant or something, and there are places where you can put like your garbage and then your compost and then your recycling, and you have that moment of like, okay, am I gonna put it in the wrong container and then contaminate that whole container, and then the whole thing is just gonna get thrown away anyways. And then finding out that most of what we think we're recycling doesn't actually get recycled at all. You know, and like it's on us as the consumer to recycle, but why is it not on the corporations to produce less plastic? So I wanted to make something with, you know, found plastic, and believe me, they're like most of the garbage at the dump is plastic. And I also wanted to think about sort of this idea that we've been sold, right, that plastic is even recyclable, because it's really not. Like you can recycle it like once, but you have to put new material in with it for it to have any kind of structural integrity. And then I'm thinking about metal, right, and I'm thinking about how gold and silver and copper are kind of infinitely recyclable. I mean, you do, in some cases, have to add, you know, fresh ore to your metal to keep the integrity of it, but it's not like plastic. So we've been kind of sold this lie, right, about one-use plastic. Single-use plastic, you use it once, but it's gonna stay around forever. It's way less recyclable than anything that's made out of metal. And so many things, right, that used to be made out of metal, that used to be crafted, you know, plates, cups, things like that, are, you know, flatware, silverware, spoons, forks. They're replaced with plastic that are supposed to be considered single-use. You're supposed to use this fork once. We used to have metal forks that last our entire lifetime, right? So I wanted to replace my own work with plastic. So I made, well, you can see these are metal molds that I made out of copper, and then I would melt plastic into them using a toaster oven in my garage. Or outside if I could, because the fumes are not great. And then, you know, I mean, I did it. I was able to replace my work with plastic, because if I had chased each one of those pieces, right, out of metal, that would have been my entire time from this residency, would just be making each one of those out of metal. Because I could cast them out of this found plastic, I could make, you know, a huge installation. I could make multiple pieces. Being an artist, you have to pivot, right? You have to, it's not a stable career. I was supposed to be a doctor. I'm a daughter of an immigrant. I did really well dissecting that fetal pig. I was supposed to be a surgeon. I told my mom I wanted to, you know, drop my whatever calculus class in high school and take art instead. She said, "You're gonna starve on the streets." You know, she's since apologized for that, but she still doesn't really know what I do. I got offered a job being an adjunct. I don't know. I was supposed to teach at State University of New York in New Paltz, and I turned it down because I was like, I want to go to Leica and I want to make armatures for movies. You know, and being an academic is something that she could understand. Making metal things just still kind of can't really wrap our head around. But anyways, you have to, I have a lot of different jobs that I have done. So I have made, jewelry and sold it in craft fairs and stores and things like that. It's a lot of hustle for not guaranteed income. It's tricky. There are more of the pieces, and then I tried to have like different scales of, my higher end pieces, and then my kind of like local craft sale pieces. I'm in a craft sale this weekend. And then there was a gallery that did buy a teapot for me, or had me send them a teapot, and then they sold the teapot. And I'm like, make more teapots. And then I had someone contact me because they had seen a picture of an octopus teapot that I had made. And that was like one of my pieces that kind of went places. Like people found it on the internet and they would contact me and say, how much is that teapot? And when I would tell them, like, honestly, it would cost like $10,000 because of the amount of time that I put into it. They're like, bye, But I did get commissioned to make this one by one person. It's hard. It's hard to connect people with your work. It's hard to connect people with money with your work. I have a hard time with that because I would love to buy art. I can't afford it. I do trades with my friends. That's a wonderful way to acquire an art collection. But it's hard navigating this world, Like my daughter tells me she wants to be an artist, and I'm like, that's great. Like you've seen, it's hard, it's a hustle. I'm not gonna, be like my mom and say, how are you gonna go to art school? Because I know that doesn't work. It didn't work with me. But I do want her to be prepared, for the idea that you will always be an artist. I think everyone is an artist, Like all kids are artists. And then somehow we get trained out of it, right? Or we get kind of taught that, it's not practical. Or that, there's this art, right, which is in galleries, and then there's this part, which is in craft sales, and then there's this, and then there's the taxidermied animals that live in the basement in Madison, Wisconsin for your entire life. I think it all has value. Okay, then I got my dream job, working at a stop-motion animation studio. I first saw the movie Labyrinth when I was like 14. You guys know that movie? David Bowie? And when I saw it, wonderful, terrifying, weird, beautiful. I saw the behind the scenes and I was like, oh my God, people have jobs making cool stuff for movies. I want this job. But I figured I had to live in LA. And then, I found out about Leica living here in Portland, Oregon. I moved here because my husband grew up here and we visited and we loved it. And it was all very lucky. So the first movie I ever worked on was Paranorman, and I showed up and I was all starry-eyed, and the person in the armature department was like, okay, here, it's over here on this table. He handed me this booklet of information of sizes of metal that I had to measure to within a thousandth of an inch to make these armatures. So then I would work on that. I learned how to use digital calipers. I learned how to use a lathe to lathe steel. I learned how to use a mill. The soldering part I had down, so I was okay with that part. And then I learned how to put all of these pieces together in an armature, and then it disappeared inside a puppet, and then I never saw it again. Which is good. Like, you don't want to see the armatures again, because if you see the armatures again, it means you've had to cut this entire puppet open, and something horrible inside is broken, and you have to fix it. And you have, your production manager, and you have the assistant director, and you have the animator all breathing down your neck saying, when is this thing going to be fixed? And God forbid you have to try to fix it on the set, like leaning over a set, trying not to break things or like bump something with your leg. You have to ruin the whole shot, which has taken weeks and weeks and weeks for the animator to do. You guys know about stop motion animation, right? 24 frames per second, you move puppet 24 times per second of animation. So animators are really lucky if they get like a couple minutes of work in a week. It depends on the show, it depends on the number of puppets in the scene, it depends on the complexity of the set, all these things I learned on the job. This was one of the first armatures that I got to make by myself. The very first one was, have you guys seen Paranorman? It was a little dog that was cut in half. That was the very first armature I got to make by myself. And then Winnie, I got to design that skirt mover for her costume. And I made so many different versions of things. You know, I tried with wire, I tried with ball and socket joints. You know, you have to work really closely with, you know, there's what's called the rigging department. All these diamond shapes in the body. So that is for a plug to go through so that the puppet can be lifted off of the ground. It has to go through here. Or if it can't support its own weight. So you have to work with rigging to make sure that, you know, the puppet can move the way it needs to. You have to work with animation to make sure that the joints are tensioned in the right way. Different animators like their puppets, the ball and socket joints of their puppets tension differently. So if they have to do a lot of movement, they may want them a bit more loose. But if they have a restrictive costume or they have a lot of material over the armature, that will, you know, make it so that you have to make the armature a little bit tighter. So it's always a really, you know, delicate balance, you know. And these things, you have to make them so that they can stand up to months and months of filming, sometimes years of filming. Wildwood is about to come out. You guys heard about Wildwood and Leica? They've been working on that movie for 5 years. So if they're, I guarantee you none of the armatures that started out in the beginning of filming are still functional. I mean, not in their entirety. They guarantee they have been broken and fixed and then broken again. Or modified depending on the scene that the animator is working on. What was that? Bam. So this was one of my favorite puppets I ever worked on. There were months and months of research and development, R&D for this puppet, trying to figure out how those plates on the front were going to move. So this one is the original sculpt, and then we had to make some modifications so that the flaps for his shoulder pads could move up and down, because we realized that he wouldn't be able to do anything with that solid piece over his shoulders. He wouldn't be able to, you know, reach for an arrow and shoot his bow. So you're working with a lot of different departments. If you're working with the silicone department, you're working with, you know, mold makers, you're working with, like I said, animators. You're working with, if your puppet wears clothing, you're working with the costume department, figuring out how to access all of these things you may or may not need to fix during the course of filming. So that's one of the animators that I'm working with, you know, trying troubleshooting that test puppet. It's an amazing feeling. I love working on these things. I love making them. I would never want to animate them ever. My brain doesn't work that way. I don't have that kind of patience. But it is such an amazing feeling when you make one of these things and then you send it out to the animators and they bring it to life. It's really incredible. So on that image, there's a scene where the beetle, the back of the shell carapace, opens up and he flies around. And it was just for one shot, but it was like weeks worth of work trying to figure out how to put that shell on a hinge, open it up, put stand-in wings, move them around, and then they ended up just being stand-in wings because in the final movie, they were VFX. That's fine, you know, it's great. Like, it's great. It's an amazing, like, when you think about the way that these things are made and you think about how all of it gets done, it's amazing to be, like, this part of it, you know. I mean, in some ways, I feel like sometimes people are like, oh, well, don't you want to do your own vision? Don't you want to make your own work? And, you know, all of those things. I mean, you're doing all these things, you know, in service to a larger vision, right? It's the director's vision, it's the company's vision. It's the way the animator is going to animate it. But, you know, I could never make something like this on my own. One of the things I really like to do with my armatures is I like to put things inside of them that no one knows about but me. So all of the beetle puppets, this is a fiberglass shell that, or fiberglass plate that his back shell attached to. So all of them, there are 15 beetle puppets, and they all had a different animal on them. Oh, and that's something that I didn't mention. You always have to make, that's why you have to do these measurements to within 1,000th of an inch. You get the design for the puppet, and you get the mold that the puppet is going to be cast into, and then you have to make multiples because the animators have to be shooting on multiple stages. And the more important a puppet is, They're called hero puppets. The more important a puppet is, the more duplicates they have, so that as many stages as possible can be shooting with the same character. Otherwise, if you just have a few, it'll take that much longer to make these movies that already take years to make. So yeah, there are 50 needle puppets. So this is kind of a more simple humanoid puppet for doing the signaling. This one we spent a long time trying to figure out a mechanism that would push the puppets' chests in and out so it would look like they're breathing. Again, for missing link, this was a chicken that sat on the head of another puppet. So I did the body armature for the puppet that I was sitting on, and then I made this teeny tiny little armature for this chicken. The head had to, be able to squash and stretch, so it had to be able to retract and then move up. So it has this kind of daisy chain of joints, ball and socket joints to move up and down, in and out. It had to have sockets so that you could take it had folded wings and then it had extended wings for when it was freaking out. So you have to be able to move, replace those wings mid-shot while the animator is working with it. I worked on Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. The head mechanics on the farther side from me were for a character that was not really supposed to be a hero character, and they got more and more complicated as the film went on. In the beginning, it was supposed to be very, very simple, and then Guillermo del Toro, who you do not say no to, wanted this puppet to do more and more and more. And so, as we were trying to film, as we were trying to get it to work, we were constantly rebuilding this head mechanic to do all of the facial features the director wanted them to do. And in the end, it ended up being a completely different head mechanic from the one that I started working on. And we were doing all this during the pandemic. For a large part of the pandemic, I was working from home while my kids were trying to do school on Zoom. So that was awful. And then this is a simple, background character head mechanic that also became more complicated as the movie went on. Body armatures, simplified background character armatures. So again, the hero puppets will have the most complicated body armatures because they have to do the most and they have to stand up to animating for the longest time. But then we'll have a lot of background characters that are made out of aluminum wire. Over here on the table, there's kind of like this flat Stanley puppet, which would be kind of like for a scene where maybe there's a crowd scene and it would just kind of be in the back, like really far away. I'm almost done. I know we're running out of time.
Do you want me to hold the this one? This one?
No, flat Stanley is literally the one that's lying down. Yeah. Yeah. So I mentioned the fact that I was working from home during the pandemic on Pinocchio. So that, what you're seeing right there, that's my basement home studio. These drawings by my kids. That's where I was working on this stuff. And for one scene, they're like, "Oh, we need these crabs. We want some crabs for this scene because they get spat out of the ocean and want some crabs to run around on the beach." And I was like, "All right." So I busted out my metalsmithing skills and I made this beautiful little brass crab and I molded it myself. And I'm not a molding and casting person. I'm so proud of myself. And I cast it in resin and I made little wire armatures so that the legs could move around. And I did all that from home and sent them in. And then they're like, "These are huge." These are the completely wrong scale because I was working in this bubble from home. Like I didn't have, that thousandth of an inch measurement that I needed to make. They still use them, which is great, but they're in the movie for like a split second. Does anyone actually? I don't know. I'll give you money if you actually notice them in that movie. No, I won't. I'd be very surprised if anyone's actually noticed them. I noticed them, of course. And then so we have the puppet hospital. So I was talking about fixing the puppets or adjusting them while they're on stage. And I made this image really chaotic because I kind of want to give that feel of how chaotic it can be. Trying to fix these puppets on stage with hot lights on during the pandemic while you're wearing a mask. Wearing optivisors so that you can, paint or cut or fill in these details on these puppets, which are then going to be filmed and shown on screens in like, whatever, 5K. There's a whole issue where we realized that the puppets were getting fuzz on them from some piece of fabric, and when it's enlarged and you see it on a big screen, it looks like, you know, they're covered in like the floor of a barber shop, just like bits of hair. It's terrible. So we had to figure all of that out. And it can be the most stressful part of my job in some ways, like if people aren't being nice, if people are being really impatient. But it can also be the most fun. And I often wonder about like the production assistants and the assistant directors and things like that, because they're the ones running around with the walkie-talkies barking at each other to get this thing done if there's a deadline. And then once the production is over, it's like, what do they do with, like, they're not getting that dose of adrenaline over and over and over, right, every single day to fix the problem. So I don't know, maybe they go skydiving. One of the most recent TV shows that I worked on, In the Know, has anyone heard of In the Know? That's why I didn't get renewed for another season. So that's another thing about this job. I love this job. It's a great job. It's also terrible because if you don't have a project to work on, which I currently don't have a project we're working on, every day I'm hoping I get a text message from a supervisor saying that a new feature film has been greenlit. I've been hoping that for 2 months. You know, so it's rough. So again, back to the hustle. You have to be good at saving. It really helps if you marry someone with money. I married someone I met in art school, so no. You know? Yeah, so TV show, it was great. It was super fun. We made simple, quote unquote, head mechanics for these ones. Again, this is the map that we leave for other people on our crew that have to do maintenance on these puppets if we happen to not be around. You have to be really good about communicating what you did in these puppets if someone else can fix it if you're not there. This is the process for making the skin for the head mechanics. I just really like these pictures. They remind me of Terminator. Oh, and but Barb also reminds me of the movie Mars Attacks. Do you guys know Mars Attacks? Mm-hmm. Originally, those puppets were supposed to be stop motion, but then they ended up being CG. But yeah, imagine trying to adjust the tension on a puppet inside the puppet's mouth while you're on stage and an animator is breathing down your neck. It's a little stressful. And that's it.